So hello everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce the next session called Immigration, Economic Integration and the Labour Market. This session is organized by the Dynamics Department of the Institut Convergence Migration. So the Dynamics Department is the department within the ICM that is concerned with the use of quantitative data and how to use quantitative data to research migration. We have about 80 fellows, most of whom are economists, but not only. Our fellows are interested in many different topics, going from migration and development, perceptions of migration, public opinion, climate change. And indeed, work and the labor market is one of the topics that interest our fellows. So, as you've seen recently, in the context of the debates surrounding the new immigration law project in France, the linkages between immigration, integration, the labor market, and economic growth are of very high interest to policymakers and the general public. And today we have the opportunity to hear from 3 of our fellows who will talk about these different linkages in different respects. So let me introduce our 3 fellows who will be Anthony Edo from CEPII will be the first speaker, and who's going to talk. He's going to give us an overview of the effects of immigration and the labor market. Based on his different works and reports he's been working on for many years. So just to give a short introduction about Anthony, he's an economist at CEPII since 2015. Prior to that, he did his PhD at the Paris School of Economics, PSC, graduated in 2014. He's an applied economist with an interest in labor economics, international migration, and trade. He's also a fellow a research fellow at ISA, and indeed of the ICM. So that's going to be our first speaker. I will then introduce later on Yajna Govind and Hillel Rapoport. So I'll give you the floor to Anthony.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to give this talk on the impact of immigration on the labor market. So what I want to do in this session is first I would like to give you some theoretical insights on how immigration can affect wages and employment. Then I would like to give you some intuition about the empirical methods that are used by economists to evaluate such impact. And third, I would like to draw some general conclusions on how immigration can affect the labor market, despite the fact, and this is something we have to keep in mind, that this is a very debated topic, a very debated literature. There are many conflicting results, but still we will try to give general conclusions on this issue. Before, let me just try to give you some facts about immigration in the world and also in Europe. So in 2020, there are around 281 million immigrants, or persons who lived in a country where they were not born. Okay, this means that the share of immigrants in the world is around 3.5%. And this share, as you can see here in black on this graph, the share of immigrants in the world is roughly constant between 2% to 4% over this period. And if you decompose the world into high-income countries, very rich countries, and the rest of the world, you can see that the share of immigrants has actually doubled between 1985 and 2015. Okay, and actually this rise in the share of immigrants in high-income countries is true for many high-income countries like Canada, Australia, the US, and also in Europe. And here what I show is the share of immigrants in EU 15 countries and between 1990 and 2020. And what you can see is that for all European countries, all EU 15 countries, the share of immigrants has increased over the past 3 decades. And as you can see, for instance, for Spain, the rise is just exceptional. all the share of migrants has increased, and what is interesting also to say potentially is that for France, the share of migrants has also increased from 1990 to 2020. It has increased from 10% to 13%, but this rise is actually the weakest when you compare this country to the other. Okay, this is something which is also important to have in mind, given the policy debate we may have in France at this time. So these migration patterns actually led this migration economist, George Borjas, to write in a book that much of the developed world is now increasingly composed of nations of immigrants. And indeed, there is a rise in the relative importance in rich countries of migration. And actually, this rise led many researchers in social sciences to investigate the consequences of immigration, the causes also of the migration flows we can observe in the world. And this research has been especially intensified since the refugee crisis in 2015-2016. So here what I showed you is simply the number of asylum applications over this period, okay, in EU 15 countries plus Switzerland. And if you remember, we have seen in 2015-2016 an historical peak of asylum application in this set of countries. In 2016, more than 1.2 million asylum application was made in this set of countries. Okay, so these inflows of immigrants, refugees, of course, raise many questions on the consequences of immigration, on the integration of immigrants, etc. Here in this talk, I will only focus my attention on one specific dimension of all the questions we may raise when we look at this graph. I will focus my attention on this question: what impact do immigrants have on the employment opportunities of a native? In other words, how wages and employment respond to immigration. So actually, the simplest view of the labor market considers a fixed number of jobs. The economy is fixed, and this view implies that immigration will tend to raise competition in the country, and immigration should decrease employment opportunities, wages and employment of pre-existing workers. I would like to raise some objections to this simple view of the functioning of the labor market, and especially because this view may lead to misleading conclusions on how wages and employment can respond to immigration. And the first objection to this is that the quantity of jobs is not fixed. The number of jobs is not fixed and is roughly proportional to population. And to support this fact, I just collected some historical data based on the French censuses for this talk between 1921 and 2017. And what you can see is that indeed, the size of employment, the number of workers, changed over time. Okay? It was 21 million in 1921. You see a decline and then a rise. It changes. The number of jobs is not fixed in an economy, and this seems to be obvious. And also what I try to collect and to put this on this graph is the size of the potential workforce, the working age population. And what you can see is that the two series tend to be correlated. They are positively correlated. And this positive correlation is even more pronounced if you just graph the two series, but with the same starting point. Okay, an index, a base index 100 in 1921, you see that the two series are strongly correlated. They go together. In other words, what does this mean? This means that the quantity of job is roughly proportional to population. So this means that a rise in the population induced by immigration will not necessarily lead to more competition, to a deterioration of the labor market. Simply because, as you can see here, that population increase as employment increase. Okay, rise in population does not mean that employment should decline. The second objection I would raise is the fact that the economy should adjust and expand following immigration. Immigrants are not only workers, They also consume. So they supply, but they also demand. And they will tend to increase the demand for goods in the economy, the demand for services, and this may stimulate the economic activity, of course, in host country, okay? Immigrants are also inventors, so they contribute to innovation, especially the high-skilled one. They are also entrepreneurs, so meaning that they start new businesses, etc. So they will, in a sense, stimulate the economic activity in the country, and they will not only increase the competition between workers. Also, in a country, and this is something we know from economic studies, the stock of capital, firms, machines, buildings are not constant. They will adjust to the new economic condition induced by immigration. And especially a rise in the population due to immigration will lead the country to employ more machine, more capital to produce more. So again, immigration does not mean that wages should decline or employment should decline. Immigration could simply make the economy just bigger, okay, in terms of size. The third objection is that this simple view here considers implicitly that all workers are the same. They will compete with each other, they are equally productive, yet we know from economic studies that labor is not a homogeneous factor. Okay? People tend to have different education level. So immigrants can be relatively more skilled than native, they can be also relatively less skilled, and therefore this means that low-skilled immigrants will not necessarily compete with high-skilled native, okay? Immigrants are native because they tend to have different educational composition, educational structure. They will not compete necessarily for the same type of jobs. They will not compete in the same labor market. And again, it's not obvious that immigration should reduce the labor market opportunities of native because of that. And second, some studies shows that even within an education category, immigrants and native may differ in terms of their language abilities, relational skills, etc. And because of that, they will tend to perform different jobs. Even if they share the same education level, they will tend to perform different jobs. And therefore, we say in economics that there will not be perfect substitutes, there will be imperfect substitutes or even complement. And there are some studies showing that actually the real competition, because of that, the real competition does not occur between immigrants and native, but the real job competition occurs within the immigrant population. In other words, immigration will not affect native workers, but can actually reduce the employment opportunities of the prior immigrants, the previous waves of immigrants, okay? So these are, of course, theoretical insights. Now I would like to provide some empirical evidence just to see if the impact of immigration tends to be positive, negligible, or negative. So here is a set of studies that try to account for all the factors I just outlined here, all the potential channels through which immigration can affect the labor market, and they try to simulate the impact of immigration on wages. So here, this is for different countries, okay, different set of countries. This is the impact of immigration on the wage of native in percent. And what you can see is that in most countries, okay, in all these studies, when you account for all the potential effect immigration may have on the labor market, you can see that the impact of immigration on wages, on average, for the whole category here, is 0 or slightly positive. Okay, this is an important result. But still, this study they have tried also to decompose this average effect across education groups, and in order to investigate the potential distributional consequences of immigration. And what you can see here is that it seems that in some countries, like Canada, Germany, and Switzerland, for instance, the impact, there is a negative impact within the high educated group. Okay? In other words, immigration in these countries, Canada, Germany, and Switzerland, have affected over this specific period of interest negatively the wage of high educated workers and positively the wage of low educated workers. In other words, immigration in these countries have reduced wages inequality between high educated workers, native workers, and low educated native workers. And why is that? It is the case mostly because the skill composition in these in the skill composition of immigrants in this country is very specific. Immigrants in this country tend to be relatively more skilled than the native population. In other words, immigration in this country over this specific period has increased the relative supply of high-skilled workers by more than it has increased the relative supply of low-skilled workers. And therefore, you have these specific distributional consequences. For the US, just the picture is different. In the US, immigration is relatively less skilled, and therefore, you have mostly an impact, a negative impact that is concentrated within the high school dropouts category. Okay? There is a negative impact among the native who have a high school dropouts, while the impact for the other native is either very negligible or positive. Okay? So this is the first set of studies, structural studies, simulation studies that try to investigate the effect of migration. For many reasons, these studies have also some limitation. So there are also another set of studies that have been implemented in order to more agnostic studies that try here to estimate the impact of immigration, not simulate the impact of immigration, try to estimate the impact of migration on wages and employment. And these studies, they actually exploit the fact that immigrants tend to cluster in a very limited number of geographical areas within a country. And then the idea of this spatial correlation approach is to compare the outcomes in the high immigration areas, so the wage and employment in the high immigration areas, and the wage and employment in the low immigration areas, the areas avoided by immigrants, I would say. And then the comparison of these outcomes will lead here the economists to measure, to estimate the impact of immigration on wages and employment. And the main result from this spatial correlation approach that, again, estimate the effect of immigration on wages and employment across geographical areas, the main result is that the impact of migration on native wages and employment is negligible. In most studies, it is negligible. Sometimes it is positive, sometimes negative. And I just collected different results, different studies that have been done in different countries. And what you can see is that most of these studies tend to find either no effect or a positive one. There are indeed some studies that find some negative wage response. And what is interesting to see is that in these studies, the negative potential effect immigration may have on the labor market is concentrated within the low-skilled segment of the labor market, meaning that those who tend to be the most vulnerable to immigration are the least skilled workers in these countries. So what is nice here is that, in a sense, the main conclusion from this alternative method, spatial correlation approach, is roughly similar to what I showed you before. So using completely two different types of methodology, simulation or estimation, you will tend to find roughly the same conclusion. On average, immigration has no impact, but immigration could have some distributional consequences. We know in the literature that these effects here, this spatial correlation, face one main limitation. And the main limitation is that immigrants decide when and where to migrate. Okay? In other words, they will tend to cluster in markets with the best economic opportunities with thriving economies. And this behavior among immigrants to locate, to settle in the best places, the best economic places, could create a spurious positive correlation between immigration, wages, and employment. In other words, the previous result, this set of results could be biased. Okay? As economists, we try to do our best to account for this issue, but it's not easy to do so. So, in principle, it may be biased. So, to reduce such bias from the fact that immigrants prefer to settle in high-wage places, some economic studies, have used massive, sudden, and unexpected immigration episodes which are driven by political factors, especially what we call natural experiments. And the advantage of these natural experiments, this huge inflow of people, is that political migrants often base their location decisions on non-economic factors. So in principle, this type of natural experiment can help us as economists to identify the causal impact immigration may have on the labor market. And there is a very famous example in Europe that have been exploited, actually, to investigate the potential impact of immigration on wages and employment. This is the large influx of repatriates from Algeria to France after the end of the Algerian Independence War in 1962. So here is the migration flows from Algeria to France between 1964 and 1968, based on the French censuses. And this is the number of migrants who actually moved from Algeria to France. And what you can see is that you see this huge peak here. Between March and December 1962, 600,000 people fled actually Algeria to France, moved from Algeria to France in response to the independence of Algeria that occurred after the Accord of Evian that was signed in March 1962. Okay? So this is an important rise in the number of people who enter mainland France. And over the whole period, 1962-1968, this is around 1 million individuals who came in France. And there is one very famous study done by Jennifer Hunt that have been done in 1992 that actually exploited this massive inflow of individuals, unexpected and large inflow of individuals, to study the impact of these repatriates in France, okay? And we know that most of these repatriates located in the south of France. So what she will do, she will tend to compare the wage and the employment in the south of France to the wage and the employment in the north of France in order to see if the repatriates had a positive or a negative impact on the wage trends in France at this time. And what she found is that she tended to find some negative effect. So she explained that the effect is negligible, but it is still negative. And I also reported not only the study by Jennifer Hunt on this table here, but most studies I know that use a natural experiment like this. So, for instance, some studies now in Colombia that try to exploit the large inflow of Venezuelan refugees in many countries, okay? And these studies tend to find, in general, although the impact is modest, they tend to find, in general, some negative effect, okay? So it's important to notice that this negative impact here is also due to the fact that these natural experiments only provide the short-run effect of immigration. Okay? The studies that try to understand the dynamic of this effect tend to show that these negative effects tend to dissipate, tend to vanish within a decade, between 5 to 10 years. So, as you have seen, there are many studies, some conflicting results in the literature. Let me conclude. Based on all this evidence, I think I can conclude that the impact of immigration on the average wage and employment is negligible in a country. Of course, for unexpected and large migration episodes, however, the short-run impact, the immediate impact on native employment opportunities can be negative. But here I want to say also it's important that these effects, of course, again, are short-run effects. And these migration episodes are just exceptional, okay? And they are not representative of migration patterns we usually see in high-income countries. But still, even if the impact of immigration has on average a negligible impact, immigration tends to create winners and losers among the native population via changes in the wage structure. So we know that an inflow of immigrants will tend to reduce the wages and employment of natives who compete with immigrants, those who have the same skills as immigrants. But at the same time, immigrants will tend to increase the wage and employment of the native who have skills who differ or who complement the skills of immigrants. So the skill composition of immigrants seems to matter in determining their impact on wages and employment, and distributional consequences are potentially important to have in mind when we talk about these results, the labor market impact of migration, but also when it comes to policy implications or to policy conclusions. So I'm done with this presentation, and thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Anthony, for this very clear presentation and for the effort at making results from studies of economics so accessible. So I invite Yajna to come in and present. So Yajna is an associate professor at Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. You completed your PhD in 2021 at PSC as well. You're, let me get that right, you're an applied labor and microeconomics economist with a strong focus on public economics, inequality and migration. You're a research fellow at the World Inequality Lab that Thomas Piketty presented yesterday, and indeed a fellow of the ICM.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. I'm just going to clarify that I'm an assistant professor at the CBS in Copenhagen. So what I'll be presenting today is a work that I have on naturalization, whether naturalization can help migrants have a better labor market integration. I think Anthony really gave an overview already of why this question is important. There's a massive or an important and sizable share of the population in developed countries that are foreign-born. Here I'm taking again the same statistics that you've seen in the presentation before mine, where around 13 to 15% of the population in the US and France are foreign-born. And if you look at this in EU countries, France stands in the middle of that. With around 13%, France is below the average EU 14 average share of foreign-born population. This is just to set the scene to say that given that the foreign-born population is going to be important in these developed countries, and especially in France, the question of migrants' integration is crucial. It has been part of the public and political debate for decades now, and it's likely to remain so in the future as well. And I'm citing very few papers in the literature that shows that migrants' integration, and specifically economic integration, tends to be desirable for migrants themselves, but also from the host country's perspective. So you can think of the fact that migrants that are integrated on the labor market will be paying their taxes, they will not be dependent, or they are less likely to be dependent on the welfare state. It's shown that they tend to commit less crime, and hence it's going to be good for social cohesion as well. And in general, the question of migrant integration is going to be central in the political debates. Currently in France, as you might all be aware, there's a projet de loi immigration that is centered around controlling immigration and improving integration of migrants. There are many different dimensions on which politicians can play in terms of migration policies. Some of them are around what are the rules for asylum seekers, what are going to be the rules to apply for visas. In other countries, there's also a debate about the rules for permanent residence, and also about naturalization. So today in this talk, I'll be focusing on naturalization, which is kind of the last step that migrants have to go through to become, similar to natives, in a sense, in terms of their legal status. In France, in the French debate, naturalization has been very central. It comes now and then, discussions about how we should design our naturalization policy. Let me give you an overview of many different changes that has been done in the past decades. Here I'm starting in 2003, but if you go back in time, there are many other reforms that took place. And the general idea of this is to show you that generally, whenever there's a discussion about naturalization, it tends to be that we tend to make it harder for migrants to get citizenship. So there are a couple of reforms that increase the language skills that are required from migrants, that increase the difficulty of the test that they have to pass, and also a reform in 2006, which is what I'm going to be focusing on, that increases the number of years through which migrants need to be married for before they become eligible. So there are many different ways on which politicians can play to make it harder or easier, and in general we see that we go towards a hardening of these immigration policies when it comes to naturalization. If you bring this back to the political debate, I think this statement in 2013 by the UMP at the time very well summarizes what are the positions around this question, at least in the French debate, but it's something that comes also in international debates. So here they are criticizing the Socialist Party by saying that they want to increase the number of naturalization to facilitate the integration of immigrants. On the contrary, we think, so that's the UMP saying, that becoming French must be the result of a successful journey of assimilation into the French community. So the kind of two positions that can be taken of this is that on one hand, we believe that naturalization is something that migrants should be given at the end of the integration process as a reward for the effort they've put into that. And on the other hand, we can think of naturalization also as a tool for integration. And what I mean by that is that getting the nationality opens many different opportunities for migrants, and it might in itself help boost their integration process. The reason why the distinction between these two is important is because the policy implication is completely different. On one hand, if you think it's only a reward, you want to make it as hard as possible so that you screen the best migrants and you give them the nationality. On the other hand, if there is evidence that it's also a tool and your aim is to integrate migrants, then you might want to make it a little bit more lenient, because in that case, you're also helping, that's also a tool to help their integration. So this is the question that I'm going to be asking in this paper and in this talk, is whether naturalization can also be seen as a tool for labor market integration. So just a parenthesis here, I'm focusing on economic integration and labor market integration in this work. Okay, so let me give you an overview of what we know already from the existing empirical literature. There's a body of work that shows that there's positive correlations between naturalization and labor market outcomes. This is just to cite a few of them. And the one in France is work by Miana Safi, who is also an ECM fellow and who presented yesterday. That what they do essentially is to compare the situation of naturalized foreigners and non-naturalized foreigners. And what they find is that it seems to be that naturalized foreigners are better off than non-naturalized foreigners. While this is very nice as a first insight into the question, it is going to meet some kind of limitations, like Anthony had just explained. It can be, this correlation and this link might be biased if you think of the selection that goes into that. So think of a pool of migrants, you know that the ones that are best integrated are the ones that are going to apply in the first place to the nationality. And then among those who apply, the ones that are the best integrated are the ones that have a higher chance of getting the nationality. So if you compare those that got the nationality to the rest of the foreigners pool, you're likely to find that there's a positive correlation. But this does not tell us, or at least it does not clearly tell us whether getting the nationality itself can help you have a better integration. So what I'm going to try to do here is to move away from this correlational evidence to a causation evidence. Like it was explained earlier, in economics we try to use natural experiments, that is reforms or shocks, that are going to allow us to kind of tease out some causal evidence. And this is one that I'm going to be speaking about today. Okay, so let me just give you a brief overview of what you need to know in the French context if you're not familiar with how naturalization works in France, and then the design to give you a sense of how I use a reform to tease out something causal about this relationship. So in France, as a foreigner who's not born in France, so who came at some point to France, there are two ways that person can apply for the French nationality. One is what we know as the general way, so anyone who's worked long enough, who's been residing long enough in France, and who fulfills all the criteria can apply through the general channel. Another way is someone who's married to a French citizen will have to, after a certain number of years of marriage, will become eligible to apply for the French nationality. And what I'm going to be focusing on, as I've said, is the marriage channel. So what I'm going to be using is a reform that happened in 2006 that exactly changed the number of years of marriage that foreigners had to be eligible to apply for the French nationality through marriage. What it used to look like before 2006 is that, just focusing on this, is that a foreigner getting married to a French citizen should wait for 2 years of marriage before they become eligible and can apply for the French nationality. What happened in 2006 is that we increased this waiting period from 2 to 4 years. That's the main change that occurred in 2006. And I mean, I'm happy, for the lack of time, I'm not going to be discussing the political environment in which this was decided, but I'm happy to discuss this later on. So what happened mainly in 2006 is we increased the number of years of marriage that a foreigner had to wait before they become eligible to apply for the French nationality. So how do I use that to say something causal about the link between naturalization and labor market outcomes? Let me try to give you a structure of how to think about this setting. So as I was saying, if you look at this framework here, someone who got married, so someone who was applying for the French nationality before July 2006 would have to show that they've been married for at least 2 years to be eligible. And someone who got married after July 2006 would have to show that they've been married for at least 4 years to be eligible for the French nationality. So this is just summarizing what the change in the law. This is if you think about what happened based on when people are applying for the nationality. But it actually had an impact on different groups of people depending on when they actually got married. And why is that the case? If you think about when they got married, someone who got married before July, so let me just start by saying everyone who got married before the reform was announced got married with the idea that they would be eligible in 2 years to naturalize. However, the reform had a shock or had an impact on these groups differently in the sense that those who got married before July 2004, thinking that they would apply for the French nationality after 2 years, they can still apply because after 2 years of marriage, they are still before the reform passes. Where that makes a difference is that someone who got married after July 2004, thinking that they would apply after 2 years again, 2 years later, the reform has passed, and now that person is not eligible anymore and will have to wait for 4 years before they become eligible. So with an example, someone who married in January 2004, in January 2006, that person applies as normal. Someone who's married in January 2005, in January 2007, that person is not eligible anymore. And that's what I'm going to leverage to say something causal in this case. So what should we expect to happen if everything was, if anyone who was eligible applied for the nationality and whoever applied got the nationality? What we should expect is something like this. So bear with me for a second. I'll explain what you're seeing in this graph. Because the rest of the results is in the similar framework. So what I'm showing on this graph is on the x-axis, it's the year of marriage in T0, and then every additional point here is 1 year after, a given year after marriage. So this is the year of marriage, this is 1 year after marriage, 2 years after, and this is 8 years after marriage. And I can keep on going with that. On the y-axis, I'm showing you what's the share of people that are naturalized. And what I'm showing you with this graph is that in the first couple of years since marriage, none of the two groups are eligible for the French nationality, so we should expect that none of them are naturalized in that period. What happens in the second year, as from the second year of marriage, is that the group, sorry, if I go back here, this is the red group and this is the blue group. So as from the second year of marriage, the red group is going to be eligible and can apply and get the nationality, while the blue group is now have to delay their application because they're not eligible anymore. And finally, after 4 years of marriage, both groups are eligible and both are going to be fully naturalized. So this is what you would expect conceptually from this framework. What we see in the data is very quickly is that again, in the first couple of years, when no one is eligible to apply for the French nationality, there's no difference in the naturalization rate between the two groups. So this is, again, the year of marriage up to 10 years after marriage. In the first couple of years, there's no difference between the two groups. But what happened as we go forward in the years since marriage is that the red group is now more likely to naturalize because they're eligible, while the blue group is not eligible in these periods, they're less likely to naturalize. And finally, at the end of the period, when both becomes eligible, there's no difference in the naturalization rate between the two groups. I'm going to skip this slide. This is just to tell you that there's fantastic data that allows us to do this analysis. This is the échantillon démographique permanent, EDP, that allows to match different sources of information together to be able to do this kind of analysis. Let me skip all of this. So again, so let me now bring you to how this relates to the labor market, why we can use this to say something about the labor market. So again, here I'm showing you exactly the same thing I just showed you. What this is showing is what's the difference in naturalization rates between the two groups. And in the first couple of years, there's no difference. It's as good as being zero, the difference between the naturalization rate. And as you move forward, one of the two groups is more likely to be naturalized than the other one. So the reason why I'm showing this is to just document that the reform had an impact. So it made that some groups could naturalize earlier, some could not naturalize, some had to wait more. If there's a difference here in the naturalization rate, then we can then go in the second step to look at what happens on the labor market. Do we find that this gap that we see here translates in a gap on the labor market? If it does, then we can say that this is the kind of corresponding effect of naturalization on labor market outcomes. So let's move to different labor market outcomes to see what happened. So here I'm plotting the annual earnings for the same group as I've defined them earlier. The red one is eligible to naturalize earlier, the blue one is going to naturalize later. And what is the important takeaway in this graph is that in the first couple of years since marriage, none of the two groups are eligible to naturalize, and you see that their salary are evolving exactly in the same way. They evolve in a parallel in the same way, and then once the red group becomes eligible to naturalize, there's a jump in their salary. So you can clearly see that here there's a jump in the salary, and this keeps going on that trend. And then the blue group that was not eligible yet becomes eligible around this period. You see that they also, the moment they become eligible, they also experience a jump in their salary. So this creates a gap between the two groups, and this gap allows us to quantify what's the causal effect of naturalization on labor market outcomes. So the takeaway from this graph is to tell you that it seems that there is plausibly a strong positive causal effect of naturalization on labor market outcomes. This is just another way of showing the same thing. So the general idea is that with this work, we're able to quantify that there is a positive causal effect of naturalization on labor market outcomes. And I think this is important for many different reasons. Before I go into a discussion on that, let me just tell you how we should think about why there is this effect. So in this paper, I'm looking at people that are married to French citizens, so they're already kind of culturally integrated to begin with. They already probably have access to, a French network for their spouse. They already probably speak the language. So there's not a lot of things that can help. I mean, naturalization should not help them that much, but still we see that there's a positive effect for them. And some of the channels through which this might be working is that I document two of them in the work that I do. One of which seems that there are suggestive evidence that people move from informality to formality. Probably naturalization gives them more outside options, so they are able to choose between different jobs. They're more free to move around in the labor market, and that makes them moving from a more precarious position to a more stable position. And then another channel for which this might be working is that I document in the paper is suggestive evidence that naturalization is being used as a signal to the employer. So it seems that employers take an information of how integrated and how good these immigrants are in terms of their language skills. And so getting the nationality seems to be reducing some discrimination or some barriers for foreigners. Let me conclude by saying that in this paper or in this project that I've presented, I'm using an experimental or natural experiment design to show that naturalization has a positive labor market effect in France in a causal way. And I think the relevance for the policymakers is that we should not only see naturalization as something that migrants should get at the end of this process. in that case, we should not always be hardening the access to citizenship, because in doing that, what we're doing is preventing migrants from getting this boost of integration. So if migrants are discriminated against because they don't have the nationality, by preventing them from getting the nationality or by making it really hard for them to get the nationality, we're just delaying their integration process. And if our aim is to integrate migrants, this is clearly a counterproductive way of dealing with this. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much, Yajna. I think it was indeed very interesting to see how we usually consider integration in the labor market as a prerequisite to social legal integration, and interrogating the sense of causality is really interesting topic and finding. For the final presentation, I invite Hillel Rapoport to the floor. He will present his note to the Conseil d'analyse économique that he has written with Emmanuel Auriol. So Hillel is professor at the Paris School of Economics. He is holding the research chair in international migration economics. He is also a scientific advisor at CEPII. I must also say that Hillel is a former director of the dynamics department at ICM. Currently, it's Jérôme Valette, who couldn't be here today with us, unfortunately. Just to say a few words about Hillel's research interest, is focusing on the growth and developmental impact of migration, as well as economic history, political economy, and the economics of immigration and diversity. I'll give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Audrey. So I will present for the first time ever in my career in English on slides in French. Usually we do the opposite, but it should be fine. So the reason, I guess, why I've been asked by Audrey and Jérôme to present this note that we did a year and a half ago for the Council of Economic Advisors of France is probably because this is an instance where we try to have a synthesis putting research results into policy proposals. Okay, so that's an example maybe of such a work, trying to bridge between research and policy advice. So this was jointly written with Emmanuel Auriol from Toulouse School of Economics. So the objective of this note for us, for both Emmanuel and I, we share this view as economists and as citizens that, and I would say as patriots, that immigration is a good thing, and that France is missing the opportunity to build on the economic benefits of immigration, and we wanted to do something about it. So I think I'm coming back to the title, is about skilled immigration, visa for growth. So we will insist on skilled immigration, but in our view, I think this is more of a strategic way to frame things, because we want to speak to the public and to the policymakers. We don't think that you can just have skilled immigration, but that may be a way to increase immigration overall, and we'll explain why. Okay? So the two objectives of the note was to show that, as I said, immigration is a good thing from an economic viewpoint, that France, contrarily to similar countries, is not exploiting the opportunities that immigration can bring about, and that the public debate is not framed correctly, and we wanted to try to correct this. First thing, when we speak about immigration in France, is mostly not about the economic dimensions, but about identity, security. And when we do speak about the economic dimension, we focus on short-term effects, such as labor market impacts of immigration, as Anthony exposed, or contribution of immigrants to public finance. And on both these two short-term dimensions, essentially the There are some effects in redistributive, for example, but overall it's not very big. I wouldn't say it's negligible, but it's not that this is something really super important economically. Neither it's not that immigrants cost 10% or bring 10% of the public budget, or that they increase or decrease wages by big margins. So we think even the economic debate on immigration is not focusing on the right thing. The right thing is the longer term, the growth perspective, which we will try to emphasize in this note. Okay, so we'll be focusing on labor migration, not refugees, not family migration, although there is, of course, many family immigrants that work. And we will want to explain, based on recent research, why immigration is an important contribution to the economy, and then we will make a few policy recommendations. So the first thing we do in the note is to have a factual statement. And the factual statement is that in France, compared to other countries, immigration is relatively small, relatively unskilled, and relatively not diversified. Okay, so we have low quantity, low diversity, and low skill composition. Here you see on the graph, it's just for 2 years, but this tells you about the general structure. If you compare, so this is comparable because these are numbers per million of inhabitants, so how many immigrants per million of inhabitants in a country, and the immigrants are disaggregated by skill level, low skill, or low education, middle education means up to high school completed, and more than high school would be higher education. So you see that in a country like Canada, you have the normal pyramid you would expect with a large, I mean, depending what you expect, but here you have many highly educated, medium number of middle educated, and a small number of low educated. Okay, so you have this kind of pyramid that you would like to have with many high-skilled immigrants, and in France you see the inverse pyramid. It's maybe more what you would expect, or I don't know what are your expectations, but much more low-skilled immigrants than middle-skilled than high-skilled. And you see this, that France is exceptional. It is the only of the main Western OECD, big OECD countries with such a structure. Okay, so overall, if you take the sum of these three, you also get an overall low number. So in France, the flows, the stocks, everything points to low immigration compared to other countries. This was also shown in the first two presentations. In France, the number of immigrants went from 10 to 13%, to cite the numbers by Anthony, while at the same time, in most other countries, the share of immigrants doubled, even tripled in the last 20 to 30 years. Okay, so we have low quantity, low skill level, and low diversity, because essentially the main motive for immigration in France is the family motive, not just reunification. It includes different family channels, and family channels tend to reinforce the existing structure in terms of origins, in terms of skill levels, and so on. Okay? So the first factual statement we do is this one, that France has a different structure in terms of low quantity, low skill composition, and low diversity. And this is not good from an economic viewpoint, because this is an immigration which brings less economic benefits. Okay? So what we want to do is to try to change the perception, and to say first that this focus on the short-term effect is not what we should do, because wage effects, employment effects are relatively small, and same thing for public finances. I already said the same, but this is just to cite a few studies that show this in the context of France. So in the short term, immigration has a low impact on both the labor market and on public finances. Now, when we start talking about long-term effects, growth, what do we think about? We think about entrepreneurship, we think about innovation, we think about different channels through which immigration boosts productivity in a country. So here you see, for example, a graph showing what is the share of immigrants among inventors, those who are patent holders, in different countries starting from the 80s until the last period, and you see that France is this black curve at the bottom, comparable only to Germany, but Germany is on a better trend, and in countries like the United States, Canada, and the UK, immigrants are way overrepresented among entrepreneurs and among inventors, compared to France, where the proportion of inventors of immigrant inventors is more or less the same as the proportion of immigrants in the population. So on the innovation and entrepreneurship side, France is not well placed. In terms of diversity, as I explained, I won't give you numbers, but however you compute diversity, it's relatively low, the diversity of immigration in France. And this is not good because we have many studies showing that diversity of birthplaces, it's not about ethnic diversity or linguistic diversity, it's about birthplace diversity. Immigrants grew up in different environments, learn different skills, have different cognitive processes, and this is the fact that you have a diverse workforce in terms of birthplace, which brings this skill complementarity and skill of knowledge. So there are many studies showing this, and so that's something which is missing in the context of France. And the fifth statement is that having a skilled workforce is an asset in a global competition, in a global world, because immigration complements other dimensions of globalization. So when you have more immigrants, you also have more links to the rest of the world. So you export more. You have more financial flows, investment, portfolio diversification, and so on. So there are tons of other things that come with immigration which are important for the productivity of a country. And by having low immigration, low diversification of immigrants, and low-skill immigrants, again, France is missing that trait. So I don't want to detail all these things. They are detailed in a note, and the note is, we also have some supplements to the note which detail some of the aspects. But when we come to policy proposals in the last minutes I have, we recommend a few things. So one thing which people know about is the point system, which has been adopted first in Australia, then in Canada, in New Zealand, in the UK, and so on. This is a system which has a few advantages. Again, it's not a substitute, because essentially the migration to France is a migration which is driven by law. Humanitarian, family. Okay, law dictates who can come to France. It's not about economic considerations. So law will stay what it is, but you can think beyond coming to France by law, coming to France for economic reasons. Okay, and the countries that do that relatively well. Of course, this system can be adjusted, adapted to the French reality, but we think it has some basic advantages. Among these advantages of the point system is it's transparent. Okay, so many of you, I guess, have done the experience to go to the website Welcome to Canada and see whether they would pass the threshold of points required to go to Canada. So if you're young, highly skilled, and highly educated, speak French and English very well, you're in, and so on. So it's transparent. You can also, this means I'm done in terms of time, or? Anyway, so it's transparent. It also means that you can prepare. You can learn French. You can choose, invest in some human capital that is desired, and this system acts as a signal as to what you should prepare for. It's adjustable. It can evolve over time. You can give more points to certain aspects depending on the needs of the labor market and so on. And you can also use it to monitor diversity. Okay? So we think it's a relatively easy to manage system, which has a lot of advantages. So our recommendation would be to think about this system for France. The second recommendation we do is to evaluate. We have many immigration policies in France, but they are not evaluated. Okay, so we do passeport talent, we do different things, and we don't evaluate them. While there is not in general in France a culture of evaluation of public policies, and we think it should be the case. So our recommendation is to evaluate this policy, which is an existing policy to attract highly skilled people, to identify whether it works, what are the bottlenecks, and so on. The third recommendation, there was one which I skipped, so this one is recommendation 4, but is the third I will mention, is to same thing, evaluate and make France more attractive to foreign students. And the last one is to improve the transition from study to work for foreign students. You see here data from the Ministry of the Interior showing that among the 70,000 foreign students which entered France in 2015, so that cohort, only 1/5 of them are still in France and working 5 years later, while 57% of them have left France, and some 14% are still students and so on. So it's a low transition from study to work, and obviously this pool of foreign students is a natural pool to draw on if you want to increase people who are skilled, diverse, and so on. Okay? So to conclude, the goal of this note was to explain the benefits of immigration, to change the view by putting more emphasis on long-term effects and on growth. As you can see, if you live in France, it has completely changed the view of the French government and public opinion. So maybe there is still more work to do. Thank you.